Hi, my name is Benedict. I haven't done a product review on my own channel for a very long time. Part of that was because of higher hertz, because I was doing it over there. And a big part of it, and part of the reason I've increasingly found it difficult to do stuff for higher hertz, is that most of the product that comes out is really just pointless wear. There's so much Me Too stuff. It's like, ooh, let's make another. And it's like the world doesn't need another poor 1176 clone. The world doesn't really need any 1176s at all. We've got more than enough of them. So there's just too much of more of the same, and people gilding their lily with, gilding their brown lily, shall we say, with all manner of hype for things that it's just not that way, or there's just a lot of scamware. And so it's difficult for me to find something that is different and that makes me think that is cool. That adds something that I can't already do either at all or easily. So what I've discovered is this fella called MAIM, as in to hurt rather badly. And obviously it's not a name that initially appealed to me, but the point of difference here is that it's, look, using Blade and Lame, and you should know those names as MP3 encoders. They decided to weaponize MP3s. And while my first thought was like, oh great, the world really doesn't need another bit reduction effect, they sound awful, this seemed to promise something different, and let me tell you, it does deliver. So let's start with the usual obligatory drum pattern. Here's one I prepared earlier. Sounds very... Enter MAIM. So it's adding its own flavour of nastification, but it does it a little differently from the typical bit reduction kind of a thing. And the results, while sometimes being sort of, are prone to actually being really rather cool. We'll go over knobs and buttons in a moment. But just as a straight A-B, obviously we're adding something that wasn't there before. Shades of ring modulation, obviously, in this situation. But we can hear MP3, and we can hear the wonderful nastiness that is MP3. And one of the great things with this is, normally I'm not big on A-Bing with distortion, but in this case we take a very clean sounding analog drum machine. Now we add some dirt to it, which, while no doubt not sounding anything like the dirt that's in a CR78 or a TR606 or something like that, creates a sense of there-ness that is not in that perfect signal. One of the claims from these guys is that all of these controls can be modified in real time without the thing stopping and restarting. Reverbs and other digital effects are prone to stopping and having to recalculate every time you move a knob. Not the case with this. It just manages. How it manages, don't know. Let's click a parameter. Let's click this one. Let's waggle a knob. Okay. So now we've got the ability to do this, and it seems to be on everything in real time. Okay, that is cool. It seems to be as advertised on the tin, which is nice. From what I can gather, and obviously this is within Reason, but Reason tends to be fussier than most, you can access basically all of the controls. It's not initially super clear what these controls are actually going to be, so you do have to RTFM, and the RTFM it's far from the worst that I've read, but it is still a little bit like, well, the bit rate reduces the bit rate. Yeah, okay. It's interesting because the beginning of the manual starts with some prose, some narrative setting the scene, telling the story. Then they forget to tell the story either within the knobs or some sense of how these are going to interact with each other, which is the common failing of them. And I think that's actually the fascinating bit. They tend to mystify. Maybe they think it makes it more secret sauce. to sort of say, oh, we did this thing and they interact with each other. Okay, great. And I know that can be a little bit complex, but I like to know how they interact with each other. Not at the mathematical level, because that's like whoosh, but in some sort of sense, you know. Twist this knob and the baboon increasingly shakes hands with the sea python. Cool. Now I've got a sense of what I'm actually doing. That is joking. No need to tell me anything about lack of baboons and sea pythons in Dorville. There's always one. So the automation is real time and it does work, and it shows every sign of working within a door, because if it works with Reason, odds on it works with other doors. You have to test that in your own. I just know that Reason can be a little bit more fussy with these sorts of things than others. Now, I'm more interested in pads and synths than I am in drum sounds. And I'm sure everybody has used drum sounds to death in their reviews of this. So we'd commonly be making our synth sound and going, okay, I've got this sound and it's okay, but it sort of sounds a bit VST and a bit unsexy. So we would commonly then do things like add some effects. And it smooths it out and it's nice, but it's not really getting there. And then we might add another layer of effects. Oh, look, I prepared this one earlier. And it becomes richer again, but it is more effect-y. Let's turn those ones off, so we've just got one layer. Then, as we get a little bit smarter, we'll start to do things like modifying the waveform. Hear how that's rigid, not unmoving? Hard to define, but moving. So we can add a couple more layers of that sort of stuff. And the sound is richer, it is more moving, but it's a specific sort of a sound and process. Enter MAIM. So obviously we can do pretty extreme and unpleasant things and then mix them in. Off. Flat. Now it's got this richness and this movement. So rather than feeling like, oh, we've just got this VST, we can actually feel like we've got a classic, particularly more of a digital type instrument in front of us, an SQ1 or something or other. I'm not chasing any specific instruments at all, but we get the feeling of this has got that kind of movement that hardware-y things were prone to having, especially when built with cheap components. So that's a really nice thing, that it's able to deliver a different result, and that can be quite minor, that nobody's going to say, oh, look, you're running that. Right up to really wacky sorts of things. Obviously that's going to vary tremendously, but it will always tend to have this, well, really, really terrible MP3 sound and feel to it. As I said before, you've got two encoders, the Blade encoder, which has a real charm. I don't think anybody in their right mind would use it now for encoding their MP3s, and the MAIM encoder, which is surprisingly good, especially at 320. But we've then got these things that we can do to enhance, or more to the point, totally mess up the codec. And the codec appears to be happening in real time. You can hear from switching the device in and out that we've obviously got some thinking time going on there. So we've got these two encoders, each has a different character. The controls are essentially the same between them. The big obvious one is simply this. That we can reduce the bitrate. As you hear, we lose a lot of definition in the top end, but the MAIM encoder is surprisingly good at hiding itself. That's not to say it isn't audible, but it's good at hiding itself for the casual listener. Whereas the Blade, not so much. Start nice to get a bet. How's your father? There is a turbo knob that they say, oh, if this isn't unpleasant enough, and then you can push this harder, and it will tend to just give you that broken up. So if you're wanting that bubbly sort of thing, and you haven't got it from here, then the turbo knob is probably what's going to get you there. There are some readouts. One of these lines, and I can't remember which is which. One is the incoming signal. The other one is what the codec's doing. Relatively pointless, probably. But yeah, they're there, and you know that stuff's happening when they're happening. And then we've got this tilt, which changes the way that the codec emphasizes. So it should emphasize more or less, depending upon which way you tilt it. To be honest, I haven't necessarily heard a difference. That's not to say that it's bad or wrong, just don't necessarily hear a big difference. We've then got this, which you've seen me play with. Apparently, I don't fully know how MP3s work on the inside. There's no reason I should, but apparently it seems to slice into sort of frequency slices and then decide how to manage it. And if one's masking the other, then they can turn the masked one off or down or whatever. That's how they actually drop data from them. That's why they're called a lossy codec, and they go through and they go, yeah, look, the person can't hear this, let's just dump it. So that data gets gotten rid of. So it's like it's zipping and just dropping things that aren't going to be heard by the user. But unlike zip, when it comes back, those things are still gone. The decode section simply turns it back into something that's playable as a waveform. So you've got this path. That's obviously everything is as everything is. And then you can start assigning things to different frequencies. So it's kind of like you can say, okay, well, this frequency slice will assign elsewhere. Exactly how it works, again, I think the RTFM doesn't give a sense of, in this position, we get that. In that position, we get this. So it's kind of like, here, yes, on that point, everything's the same as you expect. But if we go high, then the monkey is kissing the sea snake. If we go low, then the sea snake is kissing the monkey, kind of thing. It would be nice to have more of a sense, so rather than just seeming random, that it actually becomes a thing that we can control to some extent. Okay, you can play with and get a sense of it, but it'd be nice if they actually explained it. There's a random button. People like random buttons, and because this feels so random out the box, then... So you get this real sort of spectral type sound with these random movements, and that's where it's quite nice to just put some in. Another thing that could be interesting is quite simply to sample off a section, probably a more static wave, and then it can become a layer inside a sampler. But that little bit of spectrally stuff can make a very, very nice layer inside a sound. Obviously be aware that this as an effect after the whole synth is different from doing it as though it were within the oscillator. That's going to be within the oscillator, and each oscillator, each key that you press is going to have a unique instance of that process. Once you press two keys on your synthesizer and it goes into this effect, then it's actually going to give you a slightly different result from pressing one key at a time. It's the same as adding a distortion unit inside a voice as after your voice. You'll find that after the voice, as soon as you press two or more notes, that it starts to get very... because you've got a lot of intermodulation distortion. What this does, I don't know in terms of technical terms, but simply you will get a different result with one note than many notes. Sometimes it's pretty obvious, other times not. And then, of course, you can just move all these things up and down a bit. And set it back to where it was. Okay, cool. We've then got this spectral thing. We've got the ability to change the level. If you turn it right down, then you kind of only get the peaks of things. So again, another way to get that sort of bubbling sound. So it seems to cut off anything that's below a certain threshold. So it seems to sort of A, B and go, okay, no, well, you're below that threshold, silence. Oh, you've just gone over it, so we'll turn on, and as soon as you go below, silence. So it gives you an interesting result, which again can sit very nicely, because when we were like, oh, let's go. It's a bit... It's a way of filtering. There are other ways of filtering. The other direction just starts adding level, therefore you get a lot of noise. And if you have a synth or want to emulate a synth that has a lot of digital noise, then this is a pretty cool way of doing that, and add in that noise. The other side is taking the frequency of each of these slices and then rotating them. It seems to wrap. Again, the RTFM, while it tells you what's happening, doesn't do it in a way that feels like there's no story told of when you do this, this is what's happening. When you do that, that's what's happening. It's just this does that. Okay, that's probably correct. I've got no cause to doubt them. But it just lacks in a sense of, you know, what the monkey's doing to the sea snake. So we can offset. So we got that spectrally sound and some offsettiness. Straight sound. A little bit of noise. I've often said it, but my opinion on the virus was that it had a lot of noise in it, and that's part of why it seems so rich. Now, within this, the spectral effects, there's also a feedback. This is not super well explained. Somehow, obviously, it's feeding itself around. Like a delay, you do get more hanging on edness. There is an issue in that when we're in the blade version, we'll just wait in here. Okay, it didn't do it. But every time I've played with that, when it's gone and turned itself off, it's actually given a great big clunk. Maybe it's in conjunction with something else. So just be aware that I don't know if we can fairly call that a bug, but I think it is an issue that perhaps is worth looking at, that maybe the software can be given some way of knowing, yeah, look, there we go. Because feedback's high, that it should be able to know, hey, look, this should be silence, and roll it off and not do that. Because obviously if we've set up a sound that we really, really like, and we're rolling along in our piece, and suddenly, blah, not a good look. Frightened myself, I did. So that's seems to be within the blade encoder and using feedback. It doesn't seem to happen in the lame encoder in the same situation. So it's your spectral thing, and then we've got this miscellanea. In blade and lame, they are slightly different from one another. Let's just turn that down. So we'll look at the lame one simply because we get to see both, but they behave slightly different in each. So if we're listening just to signal, somehow this changes how each of these spectra interact with each other, and we get a much smoother spectral sound than the sort of chopping things up. So No action, lots of action. They say that's meddling in inappropriate ways with the MP3 codec programming. I would say that's probably very true, and it is an interesting result. And then there's this other one, which seems to change things relative to each other. And this is where, as we move to the next section, then we've got some filters. And we can lift and close down, so we can say, okay, we're going to narrow this nasty noise down. So we can have a bit more of it in the mix without it sort of hanging out the sides. If you had a monophonic line, no doubt you could actually modify this dry-wet based upon key follow, assuming you've got the ability. Reason clearly does, because all you're going to do is use a Thor or a Europa or whatever to say, okay, I want to take my key follow, where is it, key there, send it out a CV output, and then we'd fly it in the other side, which I'm not going to bother showing you all of, but you know, we'd fly it in and simply set it so that we've now got key tracking, but it'll only function well when we're playing a monophonic line. Obviously, if we're playing a chord, it's either going to take the top or the bottom note or whatever is the latest note played, and everything's going to skew and it's going to jump around. That may suit you very nicely, but it is just a thing that that would be doable if you're going, yeah, look, I want a lot more down here, but it sounds like poop up here. You could set it to become less. There are various ways. It's up to you and your DAW to know how to do that. Again, something like this is quite attractive to sample off and then use as a layer somewhere else. There are a few synths where they give you a sample layer for noise or whatever, and that's exactly what that sort of thing is about. And this is giving us an interesting and, well, for the moment, reasonably unique form of messed upness that we can fly into or apply over the top of our sound sources. So again, off. Actually, let's use this one. Pretty flat. There's just this bit of depth and richness and movement that's going on. So I think it's really rather cool. Oh, again, looking at these, we can drive our input. You can actually type numbers in here. So 12 dB, we might just want to roll some of that off. So minus 12 dB. Because processors like this are prone to behaving a little differently, when they are driven, when they go over 0 dB, they can distort. MP3 is quite well known for distorting once it goes over its 0 dB. That's a thing you could use positively or not at all, but drive is part of that. We've looked at the high and low pass filters, so we can change our gain. Yep, okay, that does sound pretty nasty once it goes over. But again, nothing to stop you from using that as a thing. So very flat, forward, one-dimensional, adding movement. Just as a matter of interest, if we add these guys back in, I think it starts to sound a little too broken. Simply because the breaky stuff here is then exaggerating the digital breaky stuff here. It is possible to put our effects first, but bear in mind they're chopping up the effects. So personally, I rather put the effects after. Of course, here you can do both. It's entirely up to you how you do it, but like a lot of digital processes, it will benefit greatly from having something that enriches it after. So the 42-cent question is, of course, is it useful? Now, as I indicated right from the beginning, I'm not interested in reviewing something that isn't useful. I'm delighted to do reviews for developers, but I have to feel like it's useful in some way and not just another me too. This one does feel useful straight away. It feels like, yeah, while I can get some processes that are sort of similar using these sorts of interrupty things that live in most serum-style additive synths that I've got all these sort of mathy functions in the middle. Obviously, it depends on the mathy functions you've got. And most of them tend to be designed to be a little bit more musical than not. But the results are different and pleasing, and you should have been able to work out already that I think that with care, it really can be either a really nice dramatic effect, as long as you don't overdo it. The last thing the world needs is just people overdoing this until it becomes the most uncool thing, but it really sits very, very nicely inside. So if I am thinking, yeah, I want that feel of an early digital synth, like I said, an SQ1, not that I ever had one. I didn't like them actually. My beloved Casio CZ, some of those, the codecs were really quite. Mine had been kicked and then knocked over by a cat, so I think by the end my CZ probably was out on the unique grindy edge, and adding some noise here is probably not untoward for nasty jitter that apparently happened to those when they drifted out of true. So in that sense, I think that it provides something that's really good, which is different from just the usual wave shapers, and quite clever that they've taken the intense liabilities of MP3. Not that I'm anti-MP3, I think MP3 is wonderful for what it achieves and what it allows us to do, but they've taken the downsides of that and turned it into something quite usable, whether that's obvious or not obvious. So yeah, big thumbs up, and it's free. I think obviously that's always a very, very nice thing when developers give things away free. I assume he developed it himself, whether for his use or just to sort of show off and say, look, I've done this, who cares? But thanks, dude, you made something that was worth making, and it may not be for everybody, but I think where I'm working, as I was saying before I so rudely interrupted myself, that we're working with something that I want that feel of a digital synth, and to give it that extra richness, this probably will be a thing that I can just reach for. So, you know, if I've got digitally sounds in Europa or most likely Algorithm. I haven't tried this pairing with Algorithm because it's obviously a very digital FM instrument. So making those sort of nice FM instruments and then adding a layer of this sort of spectral chewed uppedness is probably going to help make those sounds even more beautiful. So long as the effects go afterwards is my advice on that. So my conclusion is that it takes a little bit to start to get your head around what it's doing, and the RTFM really could help there. But play with it, spend some time, but don't just overdo it. It's if you just turn everything up to 11 and it just makes a nasty noise, and that's okay. And I know some people are going to be like, oh, look, then, you know, let's give it like lots and lots of heavy processing and say, oh, now here's our ambient album. It's odd how they all have exactly the same sound. Try to move past that and be sure that we're adding something that's nicer than just that. And that is adding a real sort of sparkle of grit, something that you don't realise there, but just makes that sound richer, deeper, more engaging. So big thumbs up, both of them from me. It's a cool device that I think is probably going to stay inside my my list of used features. Get out there, try it. Most important, have a great day.